Okay, we are live. You ready? We are going to talk a little bit more about 1991. The Hook date itself just is a center point more than the only date that goes with it. But what we see as the Cold War comes to an end, and that's 1989, is you begin to see a rise in terrorism against the United States. Most of it Soviet-backed, Soviet-armed, and even quite often Soviet-trained, even though it's different groups that are not, supposedly linked to the Soviet Union. One of the first was in 1983, and it was the Senate was bombed. And it actually happened when no one was there, but there were supposed to be 35 congressmen there having a meeting at that point, and Senator Dole had dismissed the meeting earlier than normal. And so fortunately for those that would have been there, their lives were saved from that. And one of the things that we found with President Ronald Reagan was that he did not deal with terrorists. If they took hostages, he says, we're not paying you for our hostages. You're going to give them back anyway. And so he had that strong presence in the world. And so hostages didn't take place during his time, and those that had been in place, because when President Carter, Jimmy Carter was the president before him, there were some hostages that had been taken. And part of the rhetoric of his political speeches for Ronald Reagan was that they would be returned because we weren't going to negotiate with terrorists. And you can't negotiate with terrorists. It's like going to bed with a snake and thinking you're not going to get bit. Duh. Right? So you can't, they can't be dealt with. You can't, have any reasoning with them. And then in addition to that, 1993, there was a bombing on the World Trade Center. And this was done by two Arab men from Jordan, which is not like West Jordan and Salt Lake, but Jordan, the country, which is the country that is just east of Israel over in the Middle East. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in these. They're in your book. In 1995, there was a terrorist attack in Oklahoma City at the federal building there. That was actually perpetrated by a previous U.S. military man, Timothy McVeigh. And this one took a lot more life. The others, the first one didn't have any effect because no one was there. This one here in 93, the World Trade Center, they parked a Ryder van full of explosives, and they parked it in such a way that they were hoping it would take the whole building down. It tore out about four floors of the parking structure and filled the building with smoke. So most of the damage was not life itself. 6 people were killed, 1,042 were injured. Quite a few of them from cardiac problems or smoke inhalation and those types of difficulties. And not to downplay those injuries, it's not good and it shouldn't have happened, but not as much loss of life as it could have been if they'd have been successful in bringing the whole building down. The terrorist attack in Oklahoma City, Timothy McVeigh was much more successful, unfortunately. And this was in 1995. It was until September 11th, 2001, it was the most destructive act of terrorism in the United States. It claimed 168 lives, including 19 children. It injured 680 more people, and it destroyed or damaged 324 buildings within a 16-block radius. Destroyed or burned 86 cars, shattered glass in 258 nearby buildings. And it was estimated to have caused about $652 million worth of damage. What Timothy McVeigh and his associates were trying to do was make a statement because the United States had, let me find it here so I can give you the right information. Yeah, 1995. He was a Gulf War veteran, by the way. And he was angry at how the government had handled the Waco siege and the Ruby Ridge incident. That was in 92 and 93. Both of those overreaches by the government. They should not have been doing what they did. They should not have taken those people out the way they did. Timothy McVeigh, however, did not react in the right way either. Okay. So his was a reaction to something that our government did that should not have been done against private citizens. And then all of us know the term 9/11. Well, 2001 is the year that happened. It happened on September 11th, 9/11 of 2001. And they took out the Twin Towers in New York City. They crashed an airplane into the Pentagon. And United Flight 93, no one's quite sure where they were intending to crash that. But because this flight was delayed, the passengers on it already knew about these two things. And so when the plane was taken over by these men, there were several passengers who rushed on them and they crashed the plane instead of being able to go wherever they were intending to go. Unfortunately, that meant everybody on that airliner were killed. There were 64. In the Pentagon, 125 military personnel and civilians were killed. And the Twin Towers, let me find my numbers here. Nearly 3,000 people died here at the Twin Towers. 343 were firefighters and paramedics. 23 were New York City police officers and 37 Port Authority police officers who were trying to help evacuate the buildings. Almost 10,000 others were treated for injuries, and many of those injuries were severe. Many people were trapped on the upper floors because trying to get out, those are tall buildings, hundreds of floors. And can you imagine what the stairways would have been like? Yeah. And of course, the smoke going through the building. Now, I just have to say that at least this one, it has been called into question over and over again whether or not our United States government actually knew this was going to happen, whether or not they actually were a part of making it happen, because huge grabs for power happened with each of these incidents, and especially this one, similar to what we're seeing now. And so there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the government was actually culpable for it. It's questionable how they happened to just have cameras focused on the building right at the time that the plane would crash into it. Experts have taken a look at it and have said that there's no way, because the way those buildings went down was literally an implosion, just straight down. Lots of dust, lots of ash, but generally you would expect the building to crash over and to have damage to other buildings. But those two buildings both just came down. And so it does not really make sense. So I will let you do your own research on that. I will let you make your own conclusions on that, but it's certainly a very questionable experience. Now, because of that, we have declared a war on terror. We have fought against terrorists. We've taken out terrorist leaders. There's just always another leader to come along behind them. In our family's reading right now, we're studying about the war caused by Amalickiah as he dissented over to the Lamanites and became their leader. And then when Amalickiah is killed by Teancum, that didn't stop the war. Ammoron just stepped up into his place. And if Ammoron had been destroyed sooner in the war, there would have been somebody else who would have stepped up in his place. So going in and taking out leaders or taking out cells really doesn't solve the problem. Anytime we see something in the scriptures where they have success against this type of people, it's because of the value, the virtue of the good word of God. That's what Alma did when he gave up the chief judge seat. He kept his high priest position in the church, and then he went and he taught the people, because he knew that it was more powerful than the sword. And so how do we really obtain peace in this world if we aren't using the gospel? Now, let me tell you some miracles that I know of that happened with this. As terrible as it was, and as many people as died or were injured that day, there are many stories of people who were supposed to be at work and something happened to delay them. somebody who they were sick that day, or they ended up not, just countless stories of people that circumstances happened to keep them from being able to be there that day. Our number of people destroyed that day would have been so much higher if everyone had been there that was supposed to be. And I think that when I look at those stories, I think that's miraculous. The Lord knows us. He knows what we are to do. He knows how long we're supposed to be on this earth. And so sometimes he creates the circumstances or allows the circumstances to save us too. And I think we have to look at that and see the miracle of that day as well. The way that people drew together and tried to help one another was beautiful. And it actually created, for a time, not long enough, it created a solidarity between people and a love between people, and service that happened was just something that you can't even equate. It was very, very, very beautiful. But unfortunately, we lose our memories very quickly, and we do not continue to remember the lessons that come from these tragedies. But our government is always quick to take those tragedies into effect and to create newer, stronger laws that remove more and more freedom. And so we always have to watch for that, because it's, it's part of their method of operation, is that you just don't let a good emergency go to waste. And if there's not an emergency, you can create one. But if there's an emergency, you have to, try to make sure you take advantage of it. That would be the political way of looking at these things. And obviously not the way the Lord would have us handle things. One of the things to watch for as these types of events happen is how quickly they suddenly have legislation. It's called red flag legislation, where an event, an emergency happens, and within hours they have some kind of a bill ready to be passed. That's a little fast. Legislation never happens that fast. And so if you see those kinds of things, that's why that's a red flag, should go up and say, wait a minute, that response was way too quick. They had their law written up and drawn up too quickly. That has to have already been done before the event happened. So whether they are responsible for them or whether they allow them to happen, the reality is many of the laws in response to these emergencies are questionable. So what I want to take a look at, and actually this is in the appendix, and I'm not going to go through all of it. This is a speech given by Dr. Skousen in 1978, actually. So it's in your appendix. It's called God Loves America. And I will share with you what he taught and shared about what he saw as part of our cure. I don't know that he's 100% correct, but he's definitely thinking on those lines of what can we do to fix things, right? So let's take a look at this just for a minute, because there's a lot of corruption that we have to watch for. He describes and defines two different kinds of political corruption. There's the kind that you automatically think of, and that's, taking bribes and putting your best friend into an office and those kinds of political corruptions. Some kind of a federal contract fraud or political contributions that come to you in exchange for some kind of a favor. That's one kind of political corruption. But the other kind he describes as legalized piracy. And what he means by that is that it's a way to bribe us as Americans with our own taxes while they're destroying our liberties and freedoms, while they're destroying this best friend. Okay? So legalized piracy is his term for that. And they're just shattering the Constitution. But they're, when they're giving you some kind of a stimulus, that's coming out of your tax dollars. They're not giving you something they own because they don't have anything. They're taking your money, giving it back to you, and you're saying, thank you. And that just is crazy. We just cannot continue to see that. And this was made possible in 1913 because of the 16th Amendment. 16th Amendment is the amendment that gave them the ability to tax us differently than the original Constitution allowed for, because the original Constitution had to do with numbers of people in the state and population. This is just a personal income tax. And in 1978, when he gave this tax, he said the average American would have to work from January to April. Everything he made from January to April went to taxes. That is 4 months out of your year. That is 4 months of your labor. So that's quite a bit. That's a third. That's a third. I think it's probably increased since then. And then American corporations are even in worse shape. 48% of their profits go to taxation. So it's not just individuals, it's corporations as well. You can see why they look for ways, just like we look for ways, to have some kind of an exemption for our taxes, because it's too much. But we allowed this amendment. And remember the whole hullabaloo with that, because the senator who even put this amendment out was using it to try to embarrass the Republicans. He had no intention of this passing, but he didn't understand the political forces at work in the underground back room who wanted this. And so we ended up with this amendment without the people or the states really wanting it. It's just crazy. But that just opens up the floodgates for expenditures that the federal government makes without any kind of needing to answer to us. I mean, if we've ever had taxation without representation, this is it. This is it. And it's a monumental invasion of our privacy. It's a monumental invasion of our private property. They also use these things to, they've used it to create inflation. So our dollars are worth less than they used to be. Well, that destroys your savings. And it especially is hard on your senior citizens who have spent a lifetime working, they've put savings away, or they've put together a pension fund, or whatever they've put together to be able to retire with. And it's not worth what it was before. And because it isn't worth what it was before, it's not going to be able to take care of them in retirement. So we're really robbing ourselves. And then, of course, we have way too many regulatory agencies. The Environmental Protection Agency, the this, the that, OSHA, and Fair Employment Practices, all those kinds of things that make it so that it isn't even possible for a business to make money hiring American employees. And so we send a lot of our work overseas and thereby enslave people in other nations, because their nations don't pay them what they should pay them. So we literally enslave other nations for our inexpensive products because we can't make them here because of the way we regulate business. Farmers can't make money because of the subsidy system. And President Benson warned them when he was the Secretary of Agriculture. He warned them, do not participate in this subsidy program. But it looks like free, easy money. And people don't always take the time to step back and go, what is this? Do I want this? Does this benefit me in the long run or just right now? Okay, we all have to practice a little bit of what we call impulse control. Joseph laughs because his brain injury makes impulse control hard for him. But we all have to practice impulse control. And we all have problems with impulse control. We want to buy it now and pay later. But then we don't really want to pay when it comes time to pay, right? And so we have to be very, very, very careful. And then this whole wave of centralism, trying to consolidate power, consolidate areas. You know, one of the things Thomas Jefferson was so strongly in favor of was coordination. So cities working with cities or states working with states, but not consolidation, not putting all of the power into a few people's hands. And the problem is, and that's called centralization. And it happened before any of us, including me, were really aware of what was going on because we were too young or not born yet. When you have federal agencies running things that should be run by local governments,
They don't understand local needs or problems.
Is that centralization?
Centralization.
Okay. Because I couldn't tell if the C was part of the E or not.
Nope, that's a C. I'll put a little divot in it. Now, the claim is that it will be more efficient, it will be more economical, but guess what? It didn't work in Europe, Latin America, or Asia, and it's not working here. And so what you're looking at is like your National Education Association. Who should control local education? Me. Everywhere. No, just kidding. Local education here should be handled by parents, by families, right? Things that are needed by local businesses and our roads and all of those things that now are handled on the federal level by an agency which is not constitutional. They have no one that they answer to. They answer to no one. And so it's a very, very dangerous situation that we find ourselves in. And because of this taxation, because of these federal agencies, and all these federal agencies fall under the executive branch. What's the executive branch? The president. He's the executive. They all fall underneath him. So how much power have we given to him?
Too much.
Woo! Yeah, crazy. Okay. Departments of health, departments of education, departments of welfare. They just have a stranglehold. Absolutely a stranglehold. Well, how did this, at least in part, come about? In 1937, and I'm going to let you research this a little bit more on your own, but there was a case that went to the Supreme Court called the Butler case. The Supreme Court, with this particular case, amended the Constitution judicially. Who's supposed to make amendments? Who's supposed to make amendments to the Constitution? The legislative branch. Wow, I'm failing in teaching you the Constitution.
House. Not judge.
We have talked about this all year.
I know.
They legislated from the bench. They wrote law. They rewrote the Constitution. They twisted interpretations to allow many things. The Constitution was specifically designed to prevent. Both Madison and Jefferson pointed out that Article 1 of the Constitution, and Article 1 is the one that handles the legislative branch, Congress and the House, only has 20 specific areas of power granted to it. They have a lot more now. Okay. One of those was providing for the general welfare. Do you guys remember general welfare? What does that mean to you? What does that phrase mean? Because a lot of people bandy it about, but they don't understand what general welfare is talking about. Any ideas or remembrance on that? Okay. General means like the basic, all of the population, right? General welfare. So welfare being for the good of. The welfare for the good of everyone. So anything done in the federal government should be for the general welfare. It should be good for everyone. So Andrew Jackson got himself some enemies because he vetoed things that were only going to help people in a certain region of the United States. That's not general welfare, is it? That's specific welfare. It was good for them, but these are federal funds, and that general welfare clause is that it should help everyone, not a small group of people, everyone. Okay?
Andrew Jackson was one of the smartest presidents in the world.
He did a good job with a lot of things. I would not say smartest. I don't know enough about what he did in the day-to-day. But as far as that is concerned, remember, he vetoed everything that came across his desk but one. So generally the best idea, most things that come across the president's desk just ought to be vetoed. We just don't need them.
He that rules least rules
He
best.
that rules least rules best. Okay? So in 1937, with this court decision, they interpreted the welfare clause in such a way that it was considered a general grant of power rather than a restriction on the taxing power. So it was just a misinterpretation of the Constitution. It said the Congress could appropriate money for any purpose which it considered in the interest and welfare of the American people or any segment of the American people. That's not general welfare anymore, is it? That's specific welfare. That's an issue. So by distorting that, that opened floodgates of both power and money to Washington. That really put their fingers into a lot of pies that they should not be able to touch. And like we said, we were taxing they were bribing the American people with their own money. So now when a congressman goes to Washington, whether in the Senate or the House, they will brag about how much money they're bringing into the state from the federal government.
They don't have money.
We're going to take as much of those tax dollars back to us as possible, to the state. That is not a benefit. They should be ashamed, not proud. They should be ashamed. Okay. I'm not going to go into a lot more of this. There's a whole article here. But some of the things that he is talking about. Spending the next generation's inheritance. So the federal deficit. It was $19 billion when he gave this speech in 1978. We just went through this last week. Anybody remember? I don't. I wrote it down.
Remember what?
How big the national debt is now. In 78, it was $719 billion. In 2006, it was $8,366 billion. It is currently $24,950 billion. It is more than 100 times. It's 2,400 times bigger now than it was in 1978. We are spending the next generation's inheritance. So by the change that happened with the 17th Amendment, do you remember that one? This one needs to be repealed and changed. How were senators supposed to be selected in the original Constitution? By vote or by the state legislatures?
Can't remember.
Nah, I'm failing. You guys, I'm going to give you summer work. You're going to read this Constitution and you're going to be able to tell me what every bit of it means. Every bit of it. Joseph?
Yes, Mom.
Okay. Under the original, there were two branches of legislation, right? You had the House of Representatives and you had the Senate.
Yes.
House of Representatives was proportioned by population. And they were elected directly by the people of that state. The senators were the watchdog for the states, so the states could keep their rights. Remember, we were supposed to have this balance between state and federal governments, so that if this one decided to be too heavy-handed, you could go complain to this one and maybe get some help, and vice versa. But when we took all of the states' rights away and put them in the hands of the federal government, there's nobody to watch out for the states. The senators were supposed to watch out for the states, and so they were supposed to be appointed by their state legislatures. And their job in Washington, part of it was budget, because each state was going to be responsible for parts of that budget. And so their job was not to bring money back to the state from collected taxes. It was to keep us from being taxed higher than we needed to be. And the taxes weren't personal income taxes.
The states paid and determined how they were going to raise the money that was needed to cover the federal budget. Let me go through that again. There were no personal income taxes. The senators are the watchdogs for the states. And in reality, for us. Because if the states keep their rights, we as individuals in a state keep our rights and our privileges. So they were watchdogs on government spending. They made the budget and said what could and couldn't be spent and what it needed to be spent for. Okay, that is important. Their job was not to go to Washington and say, what can I bring back to my state? Their job was to go to Washington and say, how much can I keep my state from having to pay? What's really needed? Because when I go back to my state, I'm going to have to answer to them. And if I have put them under a penalty of having to pay too much money that they have to raise from the citizens of my state, I'm out of a job. Because my job is to protect my state. So this change, now they are elected by the people, means there's nobody up in Washington representing the state or its rights. And so states' rights have been destroyed and destroyed and destroyed. Federal agencies, regulatory agencies, taking away the rights of local and state governments. All of those things are federal overreach. That's this centralization. All the power is becoming centralized in the federal government. Okay. Then, of course, we abandoned the gold standard with our money, meaning that prior to 1933, all of our money had to be backed by gold or silver or some other precious metal. It had to have something physical that you could actually exchange it for. Yeah, I've got this dollar bill. I could go exchange it for $1 of gold because it was worth that. It's no longer backed by gold or silver or any other precious metal. It's not even worth the paper it's printed on. It's worth however much the federal government, well, actually, it isn't the federal government, but it sounds federal because we call it the Federal Reserve, but it's actually a bank that's not owned by the United States. It's worth whatever the Federal Reserve says it's worth. It could be worth more tomorrow. It could be worth less tomorrow. And part of how they manipulate that is with interest rates. Okay. So our money is worth less. And of course, our farmers and the controls that they have on imports and the favoring of foreign nations, and they actually tell them what they can and can't grow. When I was growing up, we would drive to Utah every year, no matter where we lived. And sometimes that was a long drive. When you come from Texas, it's over 24 hours. And we would drive for every year. And I would drive in my family's car, and we would, my grandparents lived in West Jordan and Salt Lake City. And so we would drive up the I-15, and we would see on either side of the freeway green fields growing, because we always came in the summer. Wouldn't come in the winter if you couldn't have to. It's too cold, too windy, too snowy. And so we generally came in the summer. Plus, that's when we weren't in school. And all of those areas along the sides of the freeway were growing. Now, when I drive down the 15 going up, either the fields have been turned into homes, or quite often they're not being farmed anymore. But you can tell they were cleared at one point because they're not covered in sage. And sage takes a long time to come back. They're beginning to be overgrown with sage, which says that it's been a long time since they've been farmed. And so we're not allowing farmers to farm. I read a story once about a man, and it was on his own private property. He wasn't a farmer. He was trying to grow wheat for his family. And because there were federal regulations about how much wheat could be grown on a certain size of property, he had to go till his grain back into the ground. They wouldn't let him grow it for his own family. It was crazy. They make up things like energy crises. They make up things like viruses. Sorry, the virus is probably real, but making up how they're supposed to take care of it. So what are some solutions? First of all, get rid of those agencies. Get rid of those federal agencies. Oh, one other problem.
Federal land grab. Article 4, Section 3 describes the purposes. Article 4, Section 3 describes the purposes for which the government can own land within the boundaries of the states. In most of the Western states, they own 60% or more. And they're not supposed to have more than 4 or 5% of the land in any state. In the state of Utah, they own 66% of the land. In the state of Alaska, they own 96% of the land. Yeah, they were not supposed to do that. It would be part of the Northwest Ordinance is that when a state came in, the money was, the land that wasn't owned was deeded to the federal government that they were then supposed to dispose of in whatever way it needed to be done. Okay? And that's still a problem. A couple years ago, many of you will remember Ammon Bundy and Cliven Bundy, his father, and the problems that they had with the federal government because they were not being allowed to graze their animals on what were federal lands. Well, they shouldn't have been federal lands anymore. And they had the grandfathered clause of being able to use those lands. And all of a sudden the government said, no, you can't. We're not going to allow you to use those lands anymore because they had some other purpose for them. And they actually went in and took his cows and killed some of the cows. And it was awful. It's an absolutely awful experience for them. They've become voices for many others whose rights are being trampled on. But they spent time in jail for trying to stand up for their rights, for not backing down when the federal government said, nope, it's ours. And they even went to court, but the court decided in the favor of the government wrongly. And so it was pretty bad. So some of the solutions are getting rid of these federal agencies. The Bureau of Land Management is who they were dealing with. That's a federal agency. The land should no longer be public lands. They should be sold. We need to repeal these two amendments, number 16 and number 17. They absolutely need to be gone. And then we need to take away their rights to step into our personal lives. And one of the most important things, two most important things we can do. One, when we're sending somebody up to the Congress, they need to be a constitutionalist. They need to understand this document, and they need to stand for this document. Did you know when someone goes into office, they're not actually making an oath to listen to you? They're making an oath to uphold this. Sometimes as a people, we want what's not constitutional. That would be to our detriment. And it is and has been to our detriment when things that have been done have been unconstitutional. So someone who goes to represent you in government actually makes an oath to uphold the Constitution. And so we need to send people who understand it and are willing to stand by it. There is a lot of, I don't know. I don't know if anybody could stay clean going to Washington now. I think there's a lot of control. I think that there's a lot of secret combinations. No, I don't think. I know there's a lot of secret combinations. It may not actually be possible for them to stay clean, but we have got to try. We've got to try to put people in who are constitutional minded. And then the most important thing you can do is what we're doing right here. We are learning about this. We've been reading and trying to understand the principles that it outlines using this book. And we're trying to understand this better with books like this by W. Cleon Skousen, because he has taken the Constitution apart in here and broken it down amendment by amendment, article by article, talking about the history of it, talking about quotes, sharing quotes from the founding fathers, from the founding of the Constitution, and why they did what they did. Their own words, their own arguments. This is the most important thing you can do as far as the freedom of this nation. One of the most important thing you can do is to be righteous. we can't have the blessings of God without righteousness. But knowing what this is and what things should be, in the time of Joseph Smith, there wasn't a member of the church that couldn't quote to you the article and section and amendment that was being broken as they were driven out of lands and their rights were taken away from time after time. I've been reading the history of the church, and when they write their letters, they say, and this is from this article and this section, and it's being, and our rights are not being upheld. And they knew exactly what was being broken. Why? Because they studied this. We couldn't do that now. So in your emails today, I sent you 2 links. One is just a small portion of the Catechism on the Constitution. It's on Wall Builders, which is David Barton's group. And then the second one is it's a PDF version of the original Catechism on the Constitution written by Mr. Stansberry. And so you'll see it's the actual pages of the book that have been scanned. Both of those are available to you. It's long. It's long, but this was expected of elementary age children. That they would be able to understand and answer these questions about the Constitution. So we've got to get back to it. And I don't know how much time you want personally to give to it. It will take time, and you'll have to dedicate time to it. You'll have to say, this is, for me anyway, I have to say, this is time I'm going to spend on it. Otherwise, everything else gets in the way of it. I think the only reason we got through history this year in our house is because I committed to teach other people, and I couldn't put it off. I couldn't say, oh, I just don't feel like teaching today. So for those of you watching, for those of you who've come to our home this year for our history lessons, thank you, because it made me prepare. It made me teach. You guys should tell them thank you too. Let me hear.
Thank you.
Okay, good, because you're really enjoying this class, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Miranda's trying to fall asleep on me over there. All right. We have gone through the first 12 amendments in the Constitution. And then we talked about, of course, we've gone through all of the articles of the Constitution. And we've talked about 16 and 17. We had a brief talk about 18 and 21, and that's prohibition. It's probably important to recognize that it was repealed. Prohibition was that it was not legal to make, sell, or buy alcoholic beverages. They made it illegal. And people will tell you that so many people lost their lives because of it, and they did. But in 1933, it was repealed in December. Go back to your conference address from 1933. The president of the church at the time told them that it was important, because it was in Congress and they were trying to repeal it, that it was important that it not be repealed. He told the people what would happen if it were repealed, the damage that it would do, the lives that would be lost due to the addictive nature of that. And he even foretold other substances, because we know now there's many more substances that are addictive, far more addictive than our alcoholic beverages. He told what the toll would be on individuals and families and communities and the nation if they repealed the 18th Amendment of Prohibition. And the representatives who cast the deciding votes in the Congress were from the state of Utah. They completely did not listen to their prophet, just like they didn't listen to their prophet in electing Franklin Delano Roosevelt 4 times. 4 times. Now, I know the state of Utah doesn't make all of the decisions about who's going to be the president, but how can the Lord bless his people when we aren't listening to the prophet? So, you absolutely must understand your Constitution. You absolutely must be living righteously to expect the blessings of the Lord. We need to listen to good counsel. Now, you have to determine if that counsel is good. You are not required to do everything a church leader ever tells you to do. You need to know that. But you absolutely must know if it's what the Lord would have you do. And if it is, you should do it. And you have the right to get that revelation. You absolutely can receive that revelation, and the Lord expects you to find out for yourself. We have been told that from church leaders from Joseph Smith on. I don't think we know enough of what Joseph Smith taught. I don't think we know enough of what those original 12 taught who knew Joseph Smith, who were taught by Joseph Smith. They were there in those early scenes of the restoration of the gospel. We must go back and understand what was revealed because we don't know enough of it. We don't know enough of it. It allows us to be deceived if we're not careful. So go back and study the words of the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith by Joseph Fielding Smith. The discourses, Journal of Discourses, many of the talks given by Brigham Young, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, those original people who were there with Joseph Smith. Read and study what they wrote. You'll be surprised what you don't know, what you've never been taught. Not because of anybody else's fault, but because we're not studying it the way we should. That's our responsibility. Just like we're not spending enough time with this. All right? So I'm actually going to close a little bit early today. I was going to go through a couple of amendments, but I've changed my mind. We'll let you go through them. I'll tell you that 13, 14, and 15 were post-Civil War. Some parts of them, especially 14, were very hastily put together and were punitive on the states of the Confederacy and didn't really stand constitutionally, but they were amended and put into place. And we still have some of the difficulties that have come from that. And we will hopefully see you all again sometime.